You know what's harder than finding the motivation to weave in the ends at the end of your project? Actually finishing a blanket. Let's talk about that for a minute, because finishing a blanket is hard. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of patience, it takes a lot of effort, energy, yarn. Did I say yarn already? It takes a lot to finish a blanket. You see, the problem with blankets is we work and we work for several hours, days, or weeks, and we stretch our blanket out to look at it for the first time. Hopefully you don't look at it for the first time after a week, but you know, sometimes we just really get into it. And you look down and you don't see a ton of progress. And you're like, man, I really just need a reason to keep going on this project. This little trick gives you that reason to keep going on your blanket. It makes it feel fresh and new every, I don't know, couple of hours or so, sometimes less than that. It keeps the project interesting and fun, and it just works. I truly believe that it will help, because it's the only reason why I actually finish a couple of blankets a year. But I don't want you to take my advice. I want you to try this and see this for yourself to prove to yourself that it actually works. This blanket illustrates this tip very loud and clear, I think. Color changes. Frequent color changes is the only reason why I ever finish a blanket, because for some reason, whenever you add a brand new color to your project, it feels like you're starting the project for the first time. It just gives you that little boost of motivation and energy to get through the current color that you're working on, because you know you're going to add another one. And you just got to see it for yourself. It just works. So this pattern is totally free on my website. It's available in 4 sizes. We've got baby, lap, child, and throw, just like your standard couch throw size. So I'll have the link to where you can see the free pattern on my website in the description below in a pinned comment. There's also a PDF available if you like to have your patterns printed or saved to your device, or if you want to support the channel. That's a great way to do that. But let's talk about this blanket for a second, because not only is it really great for, you know, tricking yourself into finishing a blanket because it has so many different color changes, but it is easy enough that if you're very new to crochet, you can absolutely crochet this blanket. If you're not good at reading patterns, you can absolutely crochet this blanket. If you have a ton of yarn in your stash that you want to get through, this is the perfect blanket for that, because lots of color changes, right? So in addition to the color changes, the stitch pattern does play a little bit of a role in how easy this blanket is to start and finish, because it's very simple, but still very interesting at the same time. We use double crochet stitches throughout, but we do so in a more interesting way, so it doesn't get boring crocheting the same stitch over and over. Now, the yarn that this blanket is crocheted with is Caron Simply Soft. This yarn, you know, it's one of my favorite yarns for blankets for a couple of reasons. One, it's super easy to find. You can walk into pretty much any craft store and find Caron Simply Soft. It's also really affordable. But the other thing that I really like about it is there's a ton of color options, and that works really well when you're talking about a striped blanket. You can pretty much pick and choose any color palette that you like, and you'll have a ton of options with this yarn. That being said, this isn't the only yarn that you can use. I think this is a great stash busting project, or if you have a lot of yarn sitting around that you want to just work through, this is a great blanket for that. This blanket will work well with acrylic yarns, it'll work well with animal fiber yarns, with blended fiber yarns, with cotton blended yarns. I mean, you can seriously use any yarn you want for this blanket, and I think it'll turn out really great. But generally speaking, any medium weight yarn that you have on hand, that you find in your store, that you think is pretty, will totally work for this blanket. This blanket actually has 7 different colors. We have our background color, or color G, as you'll see it in the pattern, and that's white. And then we have 6 contrast colors to play into the stripes. You can totally go this route if you want to. Like I said, it's a great way to use up yarn that you have maybe in a drawer or wherever, that you only have 1 skein of, or maybe 2 skeins of. You can really get through the yarn that way. But it doesn't have to be this colorful. You can use 2 colors if you want, 3 colors, 4 colors, 5 colors. You could use as many colors as you have stripes for the size that you're making. You can make the stripes the same size, you can make them bigger, you can make them smaller. There's just a lot of customization that you can do with this blanket. We'll talk about some of those as we go. But for now, let's get into the stitch pattern. This is one of the most interesting ways to only double crochet in your project. I really love this stitch. It's really great. So I'm going to use a 6.5mm crochet hook. That's the recommended starting size for this blanket. And my Caron Simply Soft here, but again, any medium weight yarn you want will work just fine. So for this stitch to work out, you need to have an odd number of stitches. So I'm going to crochet a little swatch here, just so you can get the feel for how this stitch pattern is worked. But no worries if you want to just start on your blanket. There is a different starting chain number, obviously, for all 4 of the sizes, and you can find that in the pattern linked below. Even if you have no plans to start a blanket this season, give this stitch a try. I think it's one of my absolute favorites. Now, once you have your chain of specified stitches, if you're working a swatch, 23, if you're working on the actual blanket, the starting chain numbers in the pattern for all 4 sizes. Next, what you'll do is find the 5th chain from the hook. So we have 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5. There we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we're going to work 2 double crochets in the 5th chain from the hook. I like to do so working in the back bump of the chain. So that's where I'll double crochet. Whatever you like to do is the right answer, perfectly fine. If you like to crochet in the front part of the chain, that's totally fine. So we'll work 2 double crochets in the 5th chain from the hook to get it started. And these instructions will be the same no matter if you're working on a swatch here with me or you're working on one of the 4 sizes in the pattern. Next, you'll skip 1 chain and you'll make 2 double crochets in the next. And you'll just keep doing that over and over. Skip the next chain, double crochet twice into the next. So obviously if you're working on one of the 4 blanket sizes, you'll have a much longer chain. You'll repeat this many more times than I will or you will if you're just crocheting a swatch with me. So your row will look something like this. When you get to the end of your chain, you should have 2 chains left. You'll skip 1 and then just make 1 double crochet in the last. And so that's the first row in the repeat, and trust me, it doesn't get much more difficult from here. So now you will make your turning chain. I typically make 2 chains because my double crochets are a little shorter than normal, but 3 chains is considered normal. So I'll chain 3 here, and this chain 3 will count as a double crochet. So next I'll find my group of 2 double crochets here, and I'll make 2 double crochets in between them. So I'm not working my hook through either one of those stitches. I'm just crocheting between them. So put your hook between the 2 posts and double crochet twice. And this is the point where you can really start to see the stitch pattern take place, because when you first make the double crochets, they stick together, so it doesn't really look like much. But after you've made 2 double crochets between 2 posts from the row below, it really opens it up to look like a V-stitch. And this is just that. It is a V-stitch, but it's sort of it's a modified version of a V-stitch. A lot of times V-stitches will include a chain between them, and that opens them up a little bit more. I tend to prefer this option because it doesn't open them up as much, and it makes it a little bit better for a blanket. So the repeat is basically just that. Find your next 2 double crochets and make 2 double crochets between them. See, doesn't this work up like really fast? We've only been at it here for a couple of minutes and we already have a piece of work that's almost 2 inches tall. So this goes by incredibly fast when you're crocheting a blanket, which really, really helps. But you know, the whole changing color thing, that actually really helps too. And then now at the end of the row here, The last stitch that you need to work into is your chain from the previous row, and that can be a little bit confusing if you are newer to crochet, but it's really simple. So we've got our chain here, and if you count, well, I mean, you don't really have to count, but find your last double crochet and then look at the chain that's right next to it, and that's where you'll work 1 double crochet. So at the start and beginning of all of your rows here, whoops, I just totally split my yarn there. At the start and finish of your rows, you'll have 1 double crochet on either side. So you're finishing with 1 in your chain from the previous row. And so now your work looks something like this. And the last row, row number 2, is your repeat. You'll chain 3, turn your work, you'll count that as a double crochet, so you'll skip to the next 2 here and work 2 double crochets between these double crochets. Does that make sense? Are you following me? You'll make 2 double crochets between 2 double crochets from the row below. So see what I mean about the stitch pattern? It's really simple and easy. It's something that you can memorize and not even have to try. So it's great for those couch projects, the tune out and enjoy type of project. Okay, so at the end of the row here, like you did before, you'll find your chain that's right next to your last double crochet, and you'll make a double crochet there. And I mean, that's as complicated as the stitch pattern gets. That's what you'll do over and over and over until you finish this blanket. Now, if you are crocheting this blanket and you're using a different yarn especially, but even still, it's a great idea to check your gauge. Gauge is responsible for the size of your stitches and therefore the size of your project as a whole when you're finished. So when you're working a blanket, gauge isn't nearly as important as it is for a sweater, for instance, that has to fit a specific way. If a blanket is a little bit small or a little bit big, it's still going to function. But it's nice to know what size the blanket will be when you're finished, just in case you don't want it to be too small or too big. So this part is all a little bit preliminary because you only have a few rows in your swatch or potentially in your blanket, but this is how you'll measure your gauge when the time comes. You want to align your ruler with the lower edge of the stitch since this is a V-stitch and they have a tendency to spread out up at the top. Measuring it down towards the bottom will give you a little bit more of an accurate reading, and it's actually what's required to match the gauge because that's where I took my measurement. So you should count 6 V-stitches in 4 inches like you see here. The starting tick mark is aligned with the edge of a stitch on one end. The 4-inch is aligned with the edge of a stitch on the other end. So that's what you want to look for. If you count fewer V-stitches in 4 inches, even just by a little bit, then that means your stitches are a little bit bigger, and you should probably drop down a hook size so that you know the blanket will turn out the proper size and you'll use the amount of yarn that you expect to use. If you count more V-stitches in 4 inches, even just by a little bit, then that means your stitches are a little bit smaller and you should probably go up a hook size. Now don't worry, we will talk about the stripe pattern, how you go about it throughout the project, and if you want to make your own stripe pattern and do things a little bit different. But for now, I have 4 rows because that's the number of rows that I use in the pattern for each of the colors. So this would be my background color, that's what I would start with, or color G as it's written in the pattern. And the next color, we would add contrast color A or just color A in your project. If you're not new to crochet, you probably know there's several different ways that you can add a different color to your project. Use whichever technique you're comfortable with and whichever one you like. That's always the best option. One option is how you can change colors in your project but not have any extra ends to weave in. I'm going to say that again. You can change colors in your project and not have ends to weave in. So if this sounds intriguing to you, here's how you do it. You have your hook here with your old color. You'll lift up just a little bit and then remove your hook and then cut the yarn like right at the middle of that loop. Undo that last double crochet. So you've got a little bit of a tail. Don't lose this one, so you can kind of pull up on that. And then take your new color yarn and tie this around this strand. So you're not tying the two ends together, you know, like you're not holding on to both ends of the yarn and tying. You're tying like a loop knot around the old color. And you'll probably want to slide that up a little bit because the next step is to tie this around this one. So just like before, I just like to loop it around and just create a little knot. Okay, so we have two knots, and when you pull this and this together, they slide together. So this is called a magic knot, and it's magic because as you apply force or tension to the project like this, you're tying or you're pulling the knots together. So it's extremely hard to break because as you're pulling on it to break it, you're just pulling the knots together and making it even tighter. So with that, you can take these little ends and just trim them down completely. So the sacrifices to this is that you have a knot in your project. I don't mind that, to be honest. I would rather have the extra time to not have to weave the ends in. And if you're thinking, wow, that might not actually be secure, well, I mean, I tend to not disagree. Having a knot in your project means that there is a potential for a breakage, but I haven't had this knot fail me. And so I'm going to keep using it until it does fail me. So as you can see, I just finished my last double crochet. Usually the knot will end up sort of in the middle of a stitch, so you really can't even see it in your project. And then you're just ready to go with the next color, the next row, chain 3, turn it, and make 2 double crochets here between the next 2 stitches. Now alternatively, if you didn't want to use the magic knot, you could very easily just add the new color just in the standard way, just by fastening off and, you know, rejoining. And then you could weave in the end at the end of the project if you want to go that route, or you can even crochet over the tail as you're working this next round. You would just sort of align it with the stitches and crochet over it. I don't typically like that for a stitch pattern like this that has some openness between the stitches, because these stitches will cover the tail, but in between it'll kind of be there and it'll be visible. So that's why I really like the magic knot for this one. But I recognize it's not for everybody, and you don't have to do it if you don't want to. But it's there, and it's a great option if you are willing to give it a try. So that's the stitch pattern, that's the repeat, that's just how simple it is to crochet this blanket with the stitch pattern. But the next question on your mind might be about the stripes. You can follow the stripes exactly the way they're laid out in the pattern. I think 4 is a really good number. Usually by the 4th row when you're working the full blanket, that's usually about the point where I'm like, I really just want to do something a little bit different. And so that's why every 4 rows I changed colors in this blanket. As you're working your swatch, take note of how often you sort of tune out or maybe get bored with what you're working on. If it's after 2 rows, then maybe your stripes should be 2 rows instead of 4. Or maybe if you have a little bit more patience and you can go 6 or 8 rows before you're like, man, I'm really tired of this, then maybe you could do a 6 or an 8 row a repeat. So the first thing I would recommend trying if you're coming up with a different stripe pattern altogether is to use a free random stripe generator online. I've got a complete video on using these tools because I think they're just really fun and interesting. It's a great way to visualize what your colors will look like and how you might arrange them in stripes. It's just a great way to get around that creative block when you overanalyze. So don't feel like you have to work your stripes in a certain way, in a certain color, just because the pattern gives you that option. The option is there because it eliminates all the friction. You don't have to do the math and figure out how many stripes you need, how wide each stripe needs to be to fit in a certain size. You don't have to worry about that if you don't want to, because the pattern has it spelled out for you. But if you do want to be a little bit more creative in your stripe pattern, you can absolutely do so with a little bit of effort and a little bit of creativity. and maybe just a little bit of winging it. If you don't want to plan things out exactly to a T, you don't have to. You can just crochet the stitch pattern, and when you get tired of one color, move on to the next and just see where the pattern takes you. So if you're working the stripe pattern right along with me, right along with the pattern, and you have 4 rows of your first color and you finished your first row of the other color, this is where you are in the pattern. So this is my color A, and the stripe pattern here says that I need 4 rows of color A, and then 4 rows of color G, which is my background color, followed by 4 rows of color B, 4 rows of my background color. So that's how it's written. Just know that if you are following the pattern, reading the previous steps, you'll see that the stitch pattern throughout, the repeat throughout, is row 2. It's what we've seen here over and over a few times, and you'll just keep working that same pattern, that same row, throughout the entire project. But what changes, obviously, is the colors. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, leave your questions in the comments below. I'm really happy to help. While you're down there, check out the pinned comment for a link to where you can see the free pattern on my website. If you have any questions about the supplies, how much yarn you actually need for each of the sizes, the hook size, all of that stuff is in the pattern. If you want to support the channel, or you like to have your patterns printed and saved to your device for offline use or just saving for later, I have that option for you in my shop as well. B.Hooked.com is our shop for all of our PDF patterns. We have some digital pattern bundles that I've curated, some fun projects I think that you'll like to work on, but you can also make your own bundles with some pattern discounts for buying multiples. We have some t-shirts if you're into that sort of thing, and we also have some printable cards, bands, and tags that you can add to your gifts. You can provide the care instructions, personalized notes with the cards, and that sort of thing. Thank you so much for the support there. Thank you so much for watching. Happy hooking, finish your blanket, friend, and I'll see you in the next one.